Hi, we begin 1 Samuel 27 today, and actually we begin the final sequence in 1 Samuel, which will end with the death of Saul in chapter 31. Although 2 Samuel 1 will begin with another portrayal of the death of Saul. But rather than continue into 2 Samuel 1 as part of this unit, as many scholars do, I'm going to stop this unit at the end of 1 Samuel just for the completion of this book, even though really it continues directly into the next book. So what we have to deal with as we approach these chapters are a number of elements. One is the entire picture of Saul here and what the authors or editors or whoever's responsible for the final version we have in mind. And although throughout this series, and really throughout all my series here on Radical Bible, I've chosen to read these texts as the narratives in their final form and ignore some of the questions that many scholars spend much of their time with, arguing over what the original sources are or who wrote which piece or were different pieces from different time periods or not. Because it's incredibly complex, and I think most readers are not directly concerned with those issues. But when we get to the end of 1 Samuel, we really have to do that. We cannot avoid it completely, because there are a number of elements in these chapters, and I've been hinting at it in the previous chapters, that suggest that this whole unit is from a much later period than the part we'll see in 2 Samuel in terms of the actual kingship of David and the succession to Solomon at the end of 2 Samuel and the beginning of 1 Kings. That section, the so-called succession narrative, I argued in my book, Come Out My People, is one of the oldest, if not the oldest, continuous narratives in the Bible, used to justify why Solomon was the successor to David in a way that would not have been obvious to the audience at the time. So relatively recent, relatively adjacent to the time of the events written. But our story here today has a number of hints, and we've seen them already, but more we'll look at today, that this is an exilic text or a post-exilic text reflecting on the question of monarchy from after monarchy was destroyed, from after the Babylonians destroyed Jerusalem and the entire history all the way through 2 Kings was over, and prophets like Jeremiah and Ezekiel, writing from exile, were lamenting and reflecting in prayerful prophetic discourse on what the causes were that led to this tragedy and life in exile, and what might lead out of it. But as we'll see in chapter 30, that David's response to the burning down of Ziklag and the people being taken captive really highlights language from exile and suggests that this entire unit, not just chapters 27 to 31, but perhaps the entire book of 1 Samuel, is a reflection on monarchy from after the fact. As we saw in the very beginning of 1 Samuel, people like Robert Poulsen present a number of the stories in 1 Samuel, including the story of Hannah and her husband and the question of sons and kings, as little allegories. And that will continue into 2 Samuel, where some of them are explicitly allegorical. For example, the story that Nathan tells David about the rich man, the poor man, the traveler, and the ewe lamb to get him to take responsibility for taking Bathsheba and having her husband Uriah killed. That's an explicit allegory, but some of the ones that Poulsen point out are not, like that's the story of Hannah, or some others that we see along the way. But I'd like to suggest that it's at least a possibility that the entire character of Saul is a function of this. Because after all, we saw in 1 Kings 8 that the question was asking for a king. And the question of asking for a king, which upset Samuel so much, and obviously led Yahweh to say, they were not about you, Samuel, they've rejected me for being king over them, but let them have a king and see how it goes, is a perspective of an anti-monarchical view. And we already saw that back then. And so why is it then that the model of kingship that is experimented with here begins with someone like Saul, whose name literally means ask? So they ask for a king, and they get a king named Ask. Suggest that perhaps this entire story is a little bit of an allegory or a parable. David, of course, his name means beloved, and that could be a symbolic name, obviously is a symbolic name, whoever gave it to him, whether his parents gave it to him or the authors of our text gave it to him. And that's true of many names. So the very fact that Saul's name means something in Hebrew, as a word in Hebrew, does not suggest in itself it's an allegory. Almost all Hebrew names had meanings. But it's a very unusual thing to name your son Ask. And so it really is a suggestion that this whole thing is a reflection on the failure of monarchy, with Saul as the expression of it. I'm not suggesting that's the truth or the right answer, but something we at least have to consider in a way that I've not really considered it so much in some of the earlier chapters as we reach the end of this. And perhaps that'll have something to do with why there's one version of Saul's death at the end of this book when he falls on his sword, and another version that's witnessed to by an Amalekite young man who suggests that he was the one who stood over the dying king and exerted the last step of his dying. But we'll get to that in 2 Samuel. So to begin this, in the introductory overview, I'd like to just do a few things that help us to situate these chapters before we jump actually into it. And so you can see on the right side of the screen the chiasm that fits this whole second half of the book. And it begins with the symbolic death of Saul the king, when Yahweh regrets making Saul king and Samuel cuts off Saul's royal robe, as we saw. And that will come back again, because as we'll see, when Saul tries desperately to call up the spirit of Samuel when he doesn't know where else to turn, Samuel will recall that exact incident. And as we'll see in just a moment in the video we're doing today, that story in 1 Samuel 28, verse by verse, echoes various elements of the story up to this point. So is really a whole book review. And that's part of what I'm suggesting here is going on here. These chapters are written, at least these chapters, if not the whole book, to summarize the whole thing and lead leaders to reflect on it. Readers to reflect on it, I'm sorry. So as we'll see, the David amongst the Philistines in chapter 27 and in chapter 29, the first part is chiastically paired with his having been there with King Achish back in chapter 21, not this whole section, but that's the part that's the chiasm back there. And then Saul calling up the spirit of Samuel will be parallel to David with Samuel at Ramah and Saul among the prophets with Samuel, as we'll see. Then we'll see how the Philistines reject David in chapter 29, and then he rescues his two wives from Ziklag and from captivity and brings them back to Ziklag in chapter 30, echoing the beginning of David's career when he rejected the Philistines and had success there. And we'll end with the physical death of Saul and Jonathan, just as this section began with the symbolic death of Saul as king. So these chapters that we'll be looking at here are parallel to major parts of it that we saw before. Let's look a little bit at what I was pointing at in terms of the intratextual elements in chapter 28. I won't go through this in detail because, as you can see, it's very long, but I will post it on the radicalbible.net webpage, and so you can look at the details there. And of course, we'll look at the details when we look at chapter 28. But I just want to highlight it here in the overview so you can see on the left side of the screen the verses going through chapter 28 and all the specific imagery and language it's recalling various aspects of what we saw earlier, including the transgressions that Samuel accused Saul of back in chapter 15, but also many other things, all the way back to Eli and back to Hannah and other things. So as you can see on the right side of the screen, chapters taken from throughout the book that are echoed throughout this one chapter. And I think I could probably make a chart like this for any of the chapters here at the end to highlight how they're echoing things from earlier. At some level, that's not surprising. We get to the end of a text, and it's not surprising that the end echoes things we've heard in the beginning. But this is particularly the case here. Not all biblical books have that kind of a summary of all the action there, leading readers to go back and rethink the entire situation that has unfolded. That's one thing we need to pay attention to. In addition, the particular chapters we're going to begin with, chapters 27 to 29, form what I'll call a sandwich here, parallel to chapters 24 to 26 that we just finished. So as we saw, and without getting into the question of whether chapter 24 and 26 are two versions of a single incident or two different incidents, and during those videos I noted that scholars raised those questions, but I didn't address that. They're parallel there to highlight that in the center is the David and Abigail story, really the David and Abigail and Nabal story. But the important part here is David and Abigail, who gave the longest speech of any woman in the Bible, as we saw there, and she gave David good news about his future, that God had saved him from blood guilt by not killing Yahweh's anointed, and that his future as king was secured. And she also gave him a big amount of food as a present. In the passages we'll look at in the coming videos, we see David and Asash in chapter 27 when he serves the Philistines, and then he's rejected from the Philistines and expelled in chapter 29. Each of these are very short chapters, 11 or 12 verses each. And I'd suggest they're separated just so we can have this in the middle, so it can form the same kind of structure that we saw there. There's no sense that 27 and 29 are duplicates like the question of 24 and 26 up here, but they're certainly continuous, and that this story interjects in the middle is really highlighting how it's in contrast with David and Asash, but also parallel to David and Abigail. And so also a king with a woman, here with the woman of Endor. I won't call her a witch. When we get to that chapter, we'll see how many different ways that scholars have used to describe her as something other than simply a woman. And she gives Saul bad news about his future. She obviously brings up Samuel at his request, and Samuel says, "Don't bother me. Yahweh has already taken it away from you." And it ends with a meal as well, with matzah and meat, although it's not clear exactly what's going on with the meat. When we get there, we'll explore scholarly views about that. So plainly, these chapters have been arranged not necessarily in the sequence of events, but to frame them in terms of comparing David and Saul in different situations. First, showing David's insistence on not harming the Lord's anointed, as we saw repeatedly, and then Abigail being the voice that rewards him for that. And here, the woman of Endor bringing up Samuel as the voice that reminds Saul, Yahweh is done with you. While David is mysteriously serving the Philistines. Is he serving the Philistines, or is he just hiding from Saul, as we can see in at least his internal thoughts that the narrator has access to in the first verse of chapter 27? But we won't get to that till next time. There's another aspect of this that we really need to pay attention to, which is that in the sequence of chapters we have, they're not in the chronological order that we have them. Let's look at that and see how that works. So if we look at the events in the order we have them, then it seems like people are traveling all over the place. Let's look at the map for a moment and just see how that goes. So we hear David is down here in Gath in Philistine country. Then we're told that in chapter 29 that he's been given the city of Ziklag, and yet it's been burned down by the Amalekites, so he goes down there and sees that, and he'll go over to the Wadi Besor, here's the river, to rescue his wives and bring everything back. So David spends the entire time down here. But Saul and the Philistines are described seemingly going back and forth all over the place. Saul starts here in Jezreel, and then he'll be down in Gilboa, which is not, and Mount Gilboa, which is not on this map, but is roughly down in this area, in this hilly area here. Then but that's not till chapter 30. He's up in Endor in chapter 28. He went to Gilboa once, then he goes up to Endor, and then he comes back down to Gilboa. Well, meanwhile, the Philistines are described at Gath, then at Aphek here, then up to Jezreel, then to Shunem, and then to Mount Gilboa. Why are they moving all around all over the place like that? So what almost all scholars understand is that the events have been rearranged to create the sandwich structure that I'm showing you, to highlight the contrast between David and Saul. But if we see them in the order that the events are actually narrated, we see this, that the time with David and Asash is in one sequence here, highlighting that David is far removed from the situation of Saul. And then what we see here is, so David continues into this situation where he rescues his people and brings everything back to Ziklag while this is going on. So chapter 28 is happening simultaneously with David and Ziklag in chapter 30. So Saul is up there in Endor, right near Gilboa, and stays up there. And then that chapter continues with chapter 31, as Saul is already in that area and has this final fight that leads to his death. So it's a very sophisticated structure on behalf of these authors, and highlighting what I've been saying all along is that contrary to what many people, whether that's scholars or readers, think, that the biblical authors are either just simply channeling directly from God, or are the opposite, are crude editors and leave sloppy editing and doublets behind that modern scholars can easily find and show how poorly they've edited it. I'd suggest the exact opposite. These are incredibly sophisticated authors with great aesthetic sense as well as a deep theological sense of what's going on. Whether we agree with their theology or not is another question, and we'll look at that before we're done. Around several questions. One is this theme throughout that Yahweh has abandoned Saul and will refuse to speak to Saul. If we're followers of Jesus, do we believe that God chooses to abandon people while they're alive and refuse to listen to them? I doubt that. And there are a number of other aspects of what I would call the religion of empire from my book, Come Out My People, that are present in these stories, including the obvious fact that the stories claim Yahweh is on the side of kings who engage in much violence and destruction, very contrary to what I call the religion of creation. But whether we agree with that theology or not, we have to at least acknowledge that the authors are very sophisticated in what they're doing, and in the end, they're not necessarily approving of monarchy. After the 400-year-long experiment with it, perhaps they, like so many of the other authors in exile, whether those are the authors of Genesis or the prophetic books like Ezekiel or Jeremiah, or books like Leviticus, which all offer possibilities for how to regather in a new Jerusalem after exile. Perhaps the authors of our chapters here were part of that exilic or post-exilic conversation, whether in Babylon or in Jerusalem after the Persians had liberated and paid for the rebuilding here. So we have this alternate sequence there. The other thing I'd like to look at, as I was pointing out earlier, is the language of exile in 1 Samuel 30. So the chapter is very stylized. The idea that this could be a historic event where everything is taken captive but nobody is killed and everything is brought back seems very unlikely. But what it's really trying to show here is two things. One is that David is out of the way, and so David, at least according to the story, has nothing to do with the death of Saul. We'll question that when we get there, but at least that seems to be what most scholars would agree is part of the reason why the story is here. But another, as you can see from this chart, is the language of exile. And although burning it down doesn't sound specifically exilic, the Hebrew language in these places is, and I didn't highlight how rarely these words are used elsewhere apart from exilic context, because they're used a number of times in exilic context, but maybe you can just take my word for it right now until we look at the detail when we get to chapter 30, which is the phrase about burning a city down and burning the house of Yahweh, the king's house, and all of Jerusalem from the very end of 2 Kings certainly is echoing, and follows in an exilic context like Ezekiel with the question of being taken captive and the nations which they're carried captive, clearly exilic there. Similarly, from Deuteronomy, the question of after they were taken captive, they drove them off, and here we had heard that Yahweh will drive you off. This part of Deuteronomy is certainly anticipating the exile, even though parts of Deuteronomy are from the time of King Josiah in the 7th century BCE, perhaps 100 years or maybe a little less before the actual exile. And then David in great distress, and then we heard in Deuteronomy just 3 verses after the one about will drive you, in your distress when all these things have happened to you, in time to come you'll return to Yahweh your God and heed, much like David will recover everything and everyone will return to Ziklag. So this is can't be coincidental that all this language of exile is in just these opening verses of this chapter, and folks in exile, much more than modern readers now, would hear all that, because these texts would have been written relatively in the same time period, and they would be hearing them. They would know this language is in the air. So that's just one of the many possible examples of how this section of 1 Samuel, if not all of it, is probably from this late time period, reflecting on that. So in our next video, we'll begin with chapter 27, and we'll note that the narrator can look into David's heart and quote him here as he sets out and makes the astounding decision that in order to avoid Saul, he will side up with the Philistines. Will he be working for the Philistines or misleading the Philistines? We'll have to see at the next video. See you then for that.